the same time. So I think I'm right at time. Thank you for this time. It's a great opportunity. I really appreciate the chance to speak with you all. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'll turn it over to the moderator.
Hey, Gabe. Are we back live? Team, I'm looking to see if there are any questions over in the Q&A, and I don't see any over there. Gabe, Stacy, I think I'm deeply appreciative to both of you guys for coming today, and kind of appreciate the hacker's mindset and the view, Stacy, that you've shared with us around the complexity of design. It kind of strikes me that the kinds of teams that have to be involved in solving the challenges that you're talking about are pretty diverse, and like fascinating to hear the kinds of exploits that you're seeing and the way you're thinking about them. And then Gabe, I love the attention towards how complicated the space between privacy, legal, regulation. Yeah, that's just fascinating. Before we go to the next, we have maybe a couple minutes, so I'll wait and see anything in our chat. We have one from Dr. Phil Long. He's over at Georgetown. He asks, how soon does Waymo see the car becoming a mobile workspace and equipped as such?
Stacy, do you want to take that one?
I don't know really what to say there. I mean, it defines what mobile workspace means, because whether or not it's a dedicated workspace interior or whether or not someone's willing to work in the vehicle, right? And it also depends whether or not you get motion sickness. Like my wife, if we're driving, my wife, as soon as she looks down and looks at her phone, that's it, right? She's car sick. So right now we're producing, I don't want to get ahead of the business team. So right now, it's a transportation company, but you can, depending on what your work is, if you're a machinist, don't. If you use a laptop, yeah, by all means. But I think what we're going to see is kind of like, you know, various uses as I imagine it will be customer driven, right? We'll see, like, you know, what things is like, okay, now we're here. Where do we want to go? I would love to see this. I would love to see this. So I think I imagine that's how it will go forward. But that's more of a, like I said, that's more of our business and strategy team.
Yeah, I think.
Well, if there's, no, go ahead, Gabe.
No, I was just saying, yeah, I think at this point, it's, you know, people get very comfortable in the cars very quickly, and usually feel pretty free to, you know, be on the phones, you take out their computers. We've seen that frequently. As far as a dedicated, you know, office on wheels, I agree with Stacy. I think that's, you know, that may be kind of customer driven. We'll have to see how things progress once we're, you know, scale up a bit.
Well, I love the just experiencing and kind of watching Waymo here in the Phoenix Valley. When you guys rolled out the Trusted Rider program in a few of the neighborhoods, I know that you've been active about engaging with those communities, I think in ways that we maybe haven't seen from other customers. So I trust that customer driven, I also kind of appreciate the pun, approach that you guys have. And it'll be really interesting to see how folks take advantage of the opportunity to actually be in an autonomous vehicle, and then what habits they change, what that means in terms of the way they'd be using their devices or the kinds of devices that they pull out, or how we might think about issues like motion sickness and, you know, the more haptics and kind of surrounding environment they're in. It's pretty incredible the kinds of things that we can do there. Thank you guys so much for being here this morning. I'm going to let you drive off into the midday sun. And appreciate very much the time that you spent with us. All right, I think next up, I'm scanning my Zoom, and we have our panel assembled. Hello, Jamie, and Tushar, and Joanna, and Ben. Without much ado, because I just can't wait for this conversation, I'm going to hand off the, we're going to keep the, I'm just going to use as much of these metaphors as I can, but handing the steering wheel over to you, Joanna, for where the road turns next.
Well, as a person who frequently gets motion sickness, I'm very happy to have the steering wheel that keeps everything right on track for me. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending our panel today. My name is Joanna Grama. I'm a vice president with Vantage Technology Consulting Group, and I'll be moderating this awesome panel today. And we thought to get ourselves started and to just get the ball rolling, we would go around the room and ask our panelists to share what is your favorite legal themed movie, TV show, or book, and then define for us how you think about consent and what that definition looks like for you. So if we could start with you, please, Jamie.
Sure. I'm going to go with She-Hulk Attorney at Law for my favorite legal themed show. It is excellent if you haven't seen it. And how do I define consent? True consent is when someone who's requesting, in this case, data, actually asks permission in a way that is comprehensible to a lay audience for their data, with clear definitions of how they plan on using that data and for what period of time. You will not find this in the wild generally.
Thank you, Jamie. Tushar, what about you?
I'd go with The Trial of the Chicago 7. That one was a nice one for me. And as far as what digital consent means to me is concerned, I believe it is the state of both being aware of as well as in agreement with every piece of information about you that is available to someone out there.
Thank you. How about you, Ben?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with Jamie. I've been vibing on She-Hulk. Good, solid legal content there. I would define consent as a mutually agreed upon relationship that specifies both parties' duties and rights towards each other.
Right, thank you. And Bobby.
Yeah, thanks, Jana, and thanks, everyone. Well, because we're on Zoom, I can do this. I'll talk about the book. And it's Contested Futures, a Sociology of Perspective Technoscience by Nick Brown and Brian Rappert. And it's really excellent if you have the chance. And then in terms of what consent means to me, for me, it is very much about stepping into a relationship. So it is an agreement rooted in transparency and human agency, and beyond that, informing a relationship. And I'm very much inspired by Mozilla's global programs lead, J. Bob Pallotta, who talks about a need for us to make the radical seem like the mundane. Like radical ideas seem like mundane ideas. So in that spirit, consent to me means being our true authentic selves in a relationship to one another, and an opportunity to create a different kind of accountability to each other.
Oh, wow, wonderful, thank you. My background is in the law, so I think of consent in a very transactional way. I'm giving up something in order to get something else. But as my understanding of privacy and security and consent has changed, I think a lot more in terms of agency now. And so it was really wonderful to hear everybody sort of talk about agency is underlying the theory of consent. Also, I am a child of the Ally McBeal era, so that will pretty much always be my favorite legal TV show. As we start our conversation today, Ben, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to us about what consent is supposed to do in digital ecosystems.
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, some people have talked about targeted advertising as the original sin of the internet. I think that the way that we've come to rely upon the notice and consent regime is maybe up there for another candidate. But I think the work that consent is supposed to do, what it says on the box it's going to do for us, is to govern the relationships and make sure that when we deal with companies, when we deal with other people through digital media, that there's a clear understanding of what we're supposed to do for each other and what we're supposed to get from each other. I think that contracts in general have become
somewhat estranged from the way that contract law is kind of understood as a foundation of our legal infrastructure and the way that we protect individuals against concentrations of power in corporate forms and otherwise. So consent, I think, is supposed to govern our relationships, again, in between individuals and also between individuals and powerful entities like states and corporations.
Thank you. And Ben, could you just share a little bit about yourself with our audience today?
Sure, yeah.
Some context for your comments.
Yeah. So I'm a PhD student at Arizona State University. My work centers on the theory and practice of digital governance. Data governance specifically is the lens that I use most frequently.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So maybe we could talk about what is wrong with the current models, and maybe Jamie, you could start off that conversation.
Yeah, that could be a very long conversation because I think there is really a lot wrong with current models. But the biggest problem I see, and I'm a technologist by background. My degrees are in physics, and I'm on the research side here at Arizona State University with our global security initiative. But looking at the pacing problem between technology and the law and policy, that's kind of always chasing it to catch up. We developed a lot of technologies and not haven't been able to come up with the legal infrastructure to support them and have people understand what they mean in their lives. And so when we're talking about consent and these policies, I think the biggest problem is that these policies are created to ensure maximum value for the tech companies and have very few protections or considerations of the people that are using these technologies. And you see this in the way that they are presented to the user. Very few people are going to read 11 pages of EULA in order to get to an app. The way that these I don't want to call them consent because they're really not. It's like the way that these agreements are structured is basically like, as a tech company, we can collect what we want. We can change this at will and not be terribly transparent about it. But this causes all kinds of problems down the road. If you look at the history and continued pace of data breaches of all of our personal information. I mean, are you all just so tired of it? Who gets worked up about it anymore? It happens so often. Did that kind of answer your question?
That did. So your contracts 101 term today is a contract that you cannot negotiate the terms of is called a contract of adhesion. And that's essentially what these end user license agreements are that you described, because end users have very little opportunity to negotiate. Thank you for pointing that out. Tushar, could you talk to us a little bit about your perspective in what's wrong with the current models?
Right. So, I think the first thing is obviously, as Jamie pointed it out, the race between how the terms and conditions side of tech works along with tech itself is quite a wide gap. And starting off with some specific examples, I think Apple recently, a couple of years back, started this feature where they would have a green dot or an orange dot towards the top right corner of your phone, depending on whether your audio or video is being accessed at that moment. And I think a lot of other devices that do not have this functionality of like giving in moment feedback regarding what information is being used is something that could really help us be more aware of what information is accessible at the moment. Other than that, I come from Dubai, and back there the government has been very strict about privacy and consent. Because of this, back there we have FaceTime banned, there is WhatsApp callings banned, Snapchat callings banned, Instagram callings banned. And I think a lot of lack of clarity has also been this issue. There's vague definitions that these companies put into their terms and conditions for which for at least a teenager like me sometimes could be confusing around what they mean and what they defined. And a lot of companies do this where they have settings on until you turn them off by yourself. So they will mention that they have so and so information accessible, but it stays on until you go out of your way to turn it off instead of the other way around. So these are some things that I find to be wrong that could have a lot of improvement.
Thank you. As we think about sort of our legal, our functional, and our social constructs, then I was wondering if you could share with us, are there limits to what we should be using consent for in sort of the way we've been speaking about it today?
For sure. I saw Phil's comment in the Q&A, and I think that that's very apropos for highlighting these limits here. So I'll just highlight two kind of problematics in the political economy of our digital ecosystems that make consent a really unsuitable tool. So one is these group dynamics, where, for instance, the way that a lot of different digitally enabled services will function on a personalized basis is not about you as a specific individual, right? And the data that has been gathered that's attached to your name. Frequently, that's not, you're not connecting personally identifiable information to someone's profile if you're going to determine what insurance rate to give them if they're renting a car or something, or what their interest they should be charged in a mortgage. There's all these different ways that people are treated in digital systems depend on their ability to slot you into a cohort. And so if I'm going to get slotted into, a millennial white dude cohort living in middle America or something, the way that I have consented to share my information actually doesn't have as material an impact as the way that in aggregate, all the people who fall into my demographic profile, millennial white dudes in middle America, academics, et cetera, you can say whatever that slice of a cohort is, it's everybody else in my cohort in a given context who has shared their information that materially affects how this system is going to treat me. So in this sense, it's my whole cohort, and I belong to lots of cohorts, right? I could belong to guys with beards, I could belong to people who like listening to this kind of music, and it's contextual. So this idea of well, I should be smart about my individual decisions. This is the same kind of framing that has been used and is very controversial in like a public health setting. Is it the individual's responsibility to exercise and eat well, or should we be thinking about the bigger structures that create availability of healthy foods only for some people versus others? This is macro issues that we're attempting to deal with on a personalized, individualized basis. Consent is an individualized tool the way that it's currently implemented, and maybe it's by default consent is thought of as an individualized thing. Maybe individual framings are not the right thing. The second part is this long-term arc of data reuse. Every open data initiative that you come across is going to be premised on the idea that the use of data is going to be different from the idea of the eventual use of data is going to be a different use than the use that was premised at its collection point. We collect data for, we want to know if you have diabetes, but later on, we're going to be able to use that data to determine if you're going to get Alzheimer's, for example. If you consent at the point of collection to a certain use, are you going to limit the ability of that data to be reused in a helpful way down the line? Or are you going to be able to limit the use of that data for a super unhelpful, right? That in a way that could harm you. These are just two of the dimensions here. Is this social dimension where we're trying to solve collective problems on an individualized basis, and this kind of long-term issue. There's more than this, but these are just two kind of key problems in the way that our digital ecosystems are set up that consent is really ill-equipped to handle.
That's really interesting to think about it in that way. Thank you. I'd like to direct the next question to Bobby and to Shar. How do we incorporate community desires and needs about consent into how into design for systems?
Thank you, Joanna. So building on what everyone was saying already, I think we need to restructure the power dynamics and information asymmetries that exist currently. And all of you gave really great examples of what does that look in practice. Because a lot of times you see, for example, companies saying we'll never share or sell your data without your consent. But what does consent look like, right? Like, so sometimes in a privacy policy, you see that it says once you've downloaded and registered with our app, you've given us consent to use your personal information in ways that we articulate in the privacy policy. And then in the case of what's called a browser app agreement, you can even see the terms and conditions without agreeing to them by opening a web page. So there's lack of awareness, right? And people don't understand that once they start using an app, their data might be shared or shown to marketing agencies and data brokers.
Carrying on from there, I think, it's a little funny to me sometimes how, even though different apps cater to different target audiences, some are games for kids or some are, news apps for like adults. The terms and conditions for all still look the same. And, it's funny to me how these companies assume that, kids will be able to understand and interpret the terms and conditions to games and move on from there. So I think there needs to be some specification in terms of how these are set depending on the category of apps or any other form of consumption. Then the other thing I think is also that there's a lack of ease of accessibility once you either agree or disagree with these terms of conditions. Like for me, it is very hard to navigate through an app to get back to the terms and conditions later on if I want to read through them again. It seems like they almost hide them somewhere deep down so that it's not easily reachable and readable. And I also think there could be some standards set depending on the category. Um, some of the games I've played back in the day require access to your location or information that is not necessary at all. And if there's standard set across, that could really stop misuse of information from these aspects.
It often seems like it's very easy to give your consent in the digital environment, but to revoke it later or to modify it later is very, very difficult. And so I think that maybe all goes to the relationship. So Jamie and Bobby, if I could direct the next question to you, how do we secure the integrity of the relationships between users and digital providers?
I think any relationship is built on communication. And improved communication about these privacy policies and data usage agreements is not being well communicated right now. And it's offered up frequently as an ultimatum. Do you agree that we, as we are defined in Section 2A and our affiliates as defined in Section 3CI, may share for purposes current and unknown in the future? Like, it's all extremely vague. It's either yes, you can do this and then use the product, or no, peace out, right? So we have this relationship where one side is not communicating and is issuing ultimatums, and the other side saying, I don't even know what you're talking about. And so I guess I agree. We've done such a poor job of communicating, both from the technology side, well, really from the technology side, and I think the policy is trying to catch up. But being specific about usage, being really clear about how to opt out. I would love to see an opt-in model instead of an opt-out model. That's a stretch, but making it easier for people to opt in and out of things and like make a series of decisions other than like, yes, have my whole life, or no, I guess I have to walk away and not use this product.
Building on that, I think there's a need for improved accountability mechanisms for that empower people and users without creating burden for them. Like as Ben talked about, like putting too much responsibility on the individual. And then something I think about a lot is what is the role of standard bodies and civil society in evolving practices for engaging with impacted or underrepresented stakeholders. So definitely a lot of room for innovation in that space, both in terms of social, socio-technical kinds of mechanisms to accomplish that.
Ben, I know you have thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I to just piggyback on some of these responses as well. I'll put some links in the chat for everybody here. This is a project that was presented at the ACM conference on fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning this past year. And this is a project that is trying to move beyond individualized notions of consent. And then I'll also put this, I think, very provocative in this context paper by an academic named Mark Lemley at Stanford Law School, talking about, it's called The Benefit of the Bargain, and it's assessing the reality of how contracts are used today versus kind of the intentionality, 50 or 100 years ago, how they were thought about in law. I think that when it comes to playing out, let's go kind of first, second, third order effects on what it might mean to move beyond the individual model and what it might mean to think about this kind of long tail of data use. And I think that first, taking this idea of the use, we might see huge upsides in being able to reuse data for purposes other than that for which it was collected. But how do we give people agency, not just at the point of collection, but at the point of reuse, without doing this absurd transferal of administrative burden to individuals, right? You don't want to have to imagine if every day of your life you had like a new EULA to read and sign. That would be, I mean, you do that already. It's already horrible. It wouldn't be an improvement on the current situation. So how do we combine this idea of not just consenting to the use of our data in some form, but governing it for the long term? So I think that points to ideas around, there's lots of experimentation in the idea of collective data governance. Data trusts are one idea, data cooperatives, data unions. These are all different formats, right, for collective governance of assets that we're seeing brought up in different kinds of experiments and certainly proposed by a lot of different people. One issue, though, that this idea of governance faces is this idea of like, okay, let's move beyond individualized consent. Yeah, well, even within my cohort of, bearded 30-something dudes living in the Midwest who are academics, however specific I want to get, there could be reasonable disagreements between myself and other people in my cohort about how or how not our data should be used. And so how do you govern those disagreements? How do you move beyond this idea that what's good for me is good for everybody? We could have reasonable disagreements. Okay, so we need venues for these kinds of disagreements to be aired. And this points to a whole set of like governance infrastructures that we might need. Like we end up replicating the structure of our representative government for the use of our data representations and our data assets. So this opens up just a really complex set of new institutional demands. And I think this is where I see the long-term conversation going, is how do we do representative and democratic data governance instead of individualized one-point consent?
Those are really some interesting models and innovations that we could potentially see in the future. Bobby, I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit about what you're seeing in your work about different models or innovations with respect to consent.
Yeah, thank you. So in addition of data governance, right, I think I often think about how do we govern the decisions that algorithms make about us based on that data, right? So in terms of like different kind of algorithmic models and very complex, right, set of AI models, how do we think about the way that they make decisions about us? So, and I'd love to speak to two examples. And the first one is the RAIL license agreement, which stands for Responsible AI License. And I'll put in the link in the chat. And the second one is the Terms with Service agreement, which was what I'm working on during my Mozilla Trustworthy AI Fellowship, which actually this project started about maybe 2-3 years ago during a conference where the team behind the RAIL license agreement presented and organized sort of a discussion around the need for new kinds of license agreements in the context of how algorithmic models make decisions. So the concept of the responsible AI license agreements emerged from this community initiative to empower developers who build AI models to place restrictions on the use of their AI technology through end user and source code license agreements. And actually the license was recently adopted by the Big Science Initiative's set of Bloom models, which are large language models. And it'd be very interesting to see this picked up in other kinds of AI as well. And I'll add in a link to that use case so that you can have a look of what it looks like in practice. So furthermore, perhaps one of the first points of friction when interacting with any technology comes when we're faced with the fictional choice of signing a terms of service agreement, right? Like clicking on that I agree button. So resisting the take it or leave it ethos of the status quo terms of service, I'm inspired by a speculative provocation and a new social imaginary that empowers improved AI transparency through what we frame as the terms we serve with agreement. So together with collaborators, Megan Mine and Shelby, we propose an alternative to the status quo terms of service through a feminist-inspired social, computational, and legal contract for restructuring power asymmetries and center-periphery dynamics in how people interact with AI. And at its core, this project is about redesigning consent and especially contestability. So our ability to dispute certain kinds of algorithmic decisions made about us in the context of the interactions between people and AI systems. And this is in terms of also a reporting mechanism such that we could better document and improve transparency of algorithmic systems and their decisions, leveraging a symbolic logic programming approach that could improve the way that we communicate, right? As Jamie was mentioning already, like the lack of meaningful communication between tech companies and people, right? What could it look like to use the contractual agreement also as a way to create like better communication channels between people and these tech companies?
That sounds fascinating. And I really like this idea of changing the paradigm so it doesn't feel like it's all or nothing. With respect to consent. Jamie, I was wondering if I could direct the next question to you. I have some pretty strong feelings on what I am willing and not willing to share in terms of data and consent.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit what information should or shouldn't be reflected in consent processes as we know them today.
That's a great question. I would love to see very clearly stated what is collected, how long it's stored and how it's stored, who it's shared with, and not just, you know, our affiliates as designated in section blah, 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 but like who are your affiliates and why are you sharing it? So the purpose of sharing. And then how often is this agreement updated? You know, is there an annual opt-in or opt-out that we could build into these things? So you can address your own privacy and security needs in different steps of your life. The things that you feel like sharing at one phase of your life may be different than what you want to share at the next phase. people will frequently ask me, you know, what kind of tools should I use to be safe online? And what kind of things do I need to know? Because I want to be safe online. And my first question is always, well, the first thing to do is step back from the keyboard and think about what kind of things you want to be safe from. We each have our own personal threat surface, and most of them are fairly, you know, standard. But if you have particular things that you're concerned about, you want to think through what those are before you start implementing a bunch of different tools. You know, are you worried about the privacy of your children? Are you, you know, maybe you have somebody that, you know, maybe you have a stalker and you need to like have particular safety and security from that. Maybe you don't mind targeted advertising and maybe you think it's disgusting. Just there are these different things that we each want to protect, and those are going to change as our lives and our relationships with the internet evolve. So those are the things that I would like to see, you know, the what and the who and the why and how often, and then let's, you know, repeat this process and provide some alternatives. So where it's like, well, I want to use this product, or maybe I need to use this product because a lot of educational technologies, you know, I can't opt out of Google Classroom on behalf of my child, although he did unsubscribe from it and missed a bunch of assignments. So the hacker mindset translated over, and we needed, yeah, so we had a discussion about that. I was kind of proud of him. But, you know, like thinking about what it is and how often do we go back to that and why.
Tushar, I was wondering if I could maybe ask you to comment on that question as well, because you're an undergrad student at ASU, and I'm going to make some pretty big generalizations about your age and your approach to your data. I'm going to assume it's much more liberal than mine. I'm a you know, white middle-aged woman with glasses living in the Midwest, and I'm Gen X, so we're a little bit less sharing of our data. But I was wondering, do you have limits of what consent should and should not include when you're talking about your own information that you could share?
So teenagers like me tend to be oversharers. We already share a lot about our lives on social media, and you know, we tend to be more let going of you know, consent that is not a major concern to our life. But when it comes to, I think location is a big issue with me. I do not want anyone to know about where I am. I do not mind, you know, social media apps requiring my, you know, requiring access to my gallery, because you know, to post and to do anything like that, that is a functionality they need. I also do not mind targeted advertising, because many of us do enjoy seeing what has been specified for us and customized for us. And because I have good control on myself, it doesn't pull me down the advertising spiral. So I do enjoy that as well. But I think there is even amongst us, there is quite a shift in how everyone sees their you know, privacy. Many of my friends do not appreciate you know, access to all sorts of information. Many of them are very let going, so it varies a lot. But I think we are definitely much more open to, you know, more information being accessible, as long as it's not, you know, harming our security in any way.
Jamie, I shared a very similar proud moment mom moment with you when my teenage son, who's a college sophomore, decided to revoke permissions on the location sharing app so that I can now no longer follow where he is and what he's doing. So I was thrilled he'd been listening, but very much like Tushar, I think he no longer wants his mom to know what he's up to.
You know, but he had to go and find that, and he took control, and so good for him. And that's a great story.
You know,
It's
at
the
least
evolution
I haven't
of
just been wasting my breath for 20 plus years, right?
how you think about your threat vectors moment to moment in life. You know, at some point, it's like mom knowing where I am, threat vector.
Huge threat vector, right? Huge threat vector. So as I want to leave time for questions from the audience today, but I really am curious in hearing everybody's comments on Where is technology headed concerning terms and conditions, and how can we really use technology to make issues of consent more transparent to the individual and more manageable for the organization? And maybe Bobby and Jamie, if you could start us off, that would be wonderful.
Sure. I think if you're looking at it from a technology perspective, I think the changes are going to come from the providers. So, I use Firefox with a bunch of plugins, love it. They've given me the options to control my data and data surveillance in a way that individual websites will not. Or, Apple's done some really great things, I think, in privacy. Like, no company is perfect, but I think they've taken some really good steps in giving some tools to consumers to allow them to control things. So I think it's going to be privacy over the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years has emerged as a consumer preference. It wasn't for a long time. But now people are starting to say, like, hey, how do these tools and technologies intersect with my privacy and therefore my security? Because I think they are two sides of the same coin. And I think that will continue, that people will that will ask those questions, and it will be, my optimistic side will say that's, that will continue to be, it will continue to move forward and be more of an incentive in the marketplace, or at least that is my hope.
For me, it's interesting to think about computational contracts and computational agreements, and really kind of how do we use technology in a way that helps improve the communication channels and provides improved transparency and human agency, right, in the interactions between people and technology companies. And here, computational contracts, when I see that, I don't mean anything close to smart contracts and the blockchain, but very much I'm referring to the field of computational law, right, where the scholars have been evolving the notion of computable contracts to enable, it's just very much leveraging logic programming and formal verification methods, right, to create contracts that are executable, right? So, in that sense, there's improved transparency already, because in order to have a contract be executable, it needs to be very much explicit, right? So navigating vagueness and ambiguity in the contract is also possible, right? Because not the entire, some aspects of the contract are still in natural language, right? But some aspects of it are computable. So I think it's very interesting to think about evolving, right, these new kinds of computational socio-technical mechanisms, right, to like also what Ben was mentioning, to improve democratic mechanisms, right, that enable especially marginalized and underrepresented stakeholders, right, to participate, right, in this kind of contractual mechanisms.
Yeah, if I could jump in to add to all this too, I think that, and I'm seeing some questions in the Q&A as well about this, that like, so the perception of the laws behind technology development, and then finding ways to, whether it's through consumer preference, like Jamie was talking about, okay, let's create kind of a consumer movement where we create a carrot for companies to be more privacy protective. Or let's make it easy to do the right thing by having like computational contracts. I think that those are important ideas, necessary. I also think that we need to be thinking about sticks as well as carrots, because this idea of the law as behind technology development is not a natural idea or some kind of empirical truth. This is a narrative that is promoted by technology companies, because one of the key business strategies for technology companies over the last particularly 20 years, I'd say, but going back even further, is a regulatory arbitrage. The idea here is that you promote the narrative that the law can't possibly keep up with you, and therefore you can't be held to account by any particular law. So you're in a gray zone, a new uncharted space, and therefore you can't be held accountable for anything you do. And also what we do is extraordinarily complex and technical, and we have to do it at the scale that we're doing it. There's no other choice. Therefore, any solution you can possibly come up with for us to be more transparent, for us to be more human in the way that we deal with things, for us to create ways for people who have been harmed to make that harm identifiable and have recourse and have the system adjudicate itself, adjust to be able to not reproduce these kinds of harms, impossible. We're operating at scale, go away. And so I think that like, who is it? Someone in question was saying like, what do we do like as an individual here? What if we don't like terms and conditions that we have to consent to? I think this is not like a global, this is what we do. First of all, your options are fairly limited, but what we're starting to see now is sector-specific and kind of sphere-specific responses. For instance, the National Labor Relations Board starting to push back against some of the terms and conditions embedded in software that workplaces are using to surveil their employees. We're starting to see the FTC promote actions against consumer deception and fraud, that, this is what we say in terms and conditions, but we do this instead. So I think the general idea here is look for sources of existing structural leverage in the environment. It's great to have like consumer demand as a source of leverage, but we also have like an FTC and an FCC, and we have these legal protections that are not about like our digital lives, but actually about like the specific areas like health, labor. And so if we start to identify the abuses perpetuated in these areas, I think that's where we start to get traction and say like, hey, tech companies, you're doing things that are only like moderately novel, and there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on here. How about we hold you accountable to the tangible practices and abuses and harms that you're creating, and the way that like you're using terms and conditions and consent as this paper thin shield to say like, oh, we're fine. People agreed to this. There are certain rights we can't give away through agreement, and that's what I think we need to fixate on and find ways to use our existing leverage to push against.
So I think we're almost to the top of the hour. I'd love to encourage everybody to take the conversation into the Slack channel and talk about it a little bit more. I think the area where the law and technology and contracts and consent and privacy are all munging up against one another is a fascinating place. I think we're going to see a lot of changes in this area, particularly over the next couple of years as our lawyers and our legislators and our judges become more technology savvy, because let's face it, I know my cohort, they're not writ large. And so as folks age out, we will see changes in this place that I think will be quite interesting. And so I hope that we get to hear from all of you again very soon about what's going on in this space. Thank you for your time today.